Well, on Tuesday evening, I was over at Mark and Rhonda's house to meet with Lowell Flory, who is, I think, the Director of Development at Bethany Theological Seminary, where Rhonda and I both went to seminary. And Rhonda's on the seminary board, and we were joined there by a number of other folks, some others who had also been to Bethany at one time or another, and some other interested people, and had a fairly interesting conversation about the changes that are happening in our country as we become more secular and move into what many are calling a post-Christian age. Gone are the days when Sunday was for church, for instance, when there was an assumption and expectation that everyone was in church somewhere and that we would be there and that we just lived in a Christian culture. I think I've mentioned before, when I left seminary and I went to my first church in Ohio, there was a retired pastor there who had been the pastor there for about 20 years, had a long run there, and in the 50s and into the 60s. And then he'd gone elsewhere, and then he was back and living there in retirement. And we'd get together, and he was a great source of support, but he would bemoan just constantly the fact that, what is wrong with people anymore? Don't they know that they should be in church? And that they should not be doing other things on Sunday morning? Already then the shift was happening. And on Tuesday we were talking about what it means for the church and what it means for theological education. And what it means is that it's a lot harder. For churches, it means that you cannot assume that people will be present anymore, and that there is just an assumption that good people will be in church and that everybody will be there, and you don't have to worry about that. It means in churches that you have to make a case for why people should be at church on Sunday morning or on some other day of the week and not somewhere else. And for seminaries, it means that ministry formation looks an awful lot different. One of the questions was asked of those who went to seminary some time ago was, when you were in seminary, did you see this coming? And was there anyone talking about it or preparing you for what was coming? And when I was in seminary, there was no inkling that the change was coming. And it didn't really begin to become clear to me until I got out in the church and could really see that we were changing. I've said here many times that as challenging as it is, I think it's the very best thing that could possibly happen to the church and to Christianity. Not taking for granted that people will be there. Not assuming that everyone knows what you're talking about when you talk about your faith or Christianity means that you have to be on your game. It means you have to know what you believe and why, and you have to be able to talk about it, and you have to be able to talk intelligently and with some compassion also, and understanding to people about why you do what you do. And I think that's a good thing. Last week I mentioned that I was going to be talking about the book by Diana Butler Bass, Christianity After Religion. And she says in that book that during the first several hundred years of Christianity, roughly from the time of Jesus to 400 CE, Christianity was understood as a way of life based on faith or trust in Jesus and God. But between 300 and 400, this dynamic sense of living in Jesus was displaced by an increasing emphasis on creeds and beliefs. And she says, for many centuries since then, Christians have equated faith with belief. Being faithful meant that one accepted certain ideas about God and Jesus, especially as articulated in creedal statements. Denominations specified what adherents must believe about the sacraments, salvation, and authority. Confirmation in faith entailed memorization and recitation of doctrine or facts about the Bible. Some groups even insisted that true Christians must further believe particular ideas about drinking, women, science, end times, politics, baptism. It's not in their Bible to say baptism. I still remember being in seminary and a particular professor at the time talked about, the Church of the Brethren does baptism 3 times, and only adults. And this conversation about the fact that even though we live in a much more diverse culture of religion, we still were the only ones who were doing baptism the right way. We were still having that conversation in seminary. Layers of belief, she goes on, stacked through the centuries from the apostles to our own times. Alongside this weighty pile of beliefs, it often seems as if Christians actually live their beliefs less. Beliefs like God is love, or blessed are the peacemakers, or love your neighbor as yourself, thus leading to often heard charges of hypocrisy. With this accretion of beliefs, a corresponding incredulity, I can't even say the word, spread through Western culture, leading to doctrinal boredom, skepticism, agnosticism, and atheism. As science, history, and psychology offered ever more sophisticated understandings of the universe and human experience, some Christians became increasingly hostile to secular knowledge, building museums to creationism, proclaiming that America is a Christian nation, excommunicating those who would question the existence of hell. Put simply, as they reacted to unbelief, certain Christians asked for more belief about increasingly unbelievable things. And so we have this growing gap, she talks about, between those who are on the edge of Christianity or leaving Christianity and some Christians who are clinging even more fervently to their belief. And, there's just this gap that grows. And in the midst of that, there is what she talks about, this resurgence of spirituality, which is free of the doctrine and free of the argument and concern about all of these things that so much of Christianity cared so much about for so long. She quotes Harvey Cox, who is a theologian from Harvard, who says that for faith is actually resurgent all across America, while dogma is dying. The spiritual, communal, and justice-seeking dimensions of Christianity are now the leading edge. A religion based on subscribing to mandatory beliefs is no longer viable. And when questioned by an interview about this thesis, Cox explained, "What I see and what a lot of others too see is that people frequently want to refer to themselves now as not religious, but spiritual," which is what I was talking about last week. He says, "I used to be very suspicious of this, but I began asking questions and finding out what the dimensions of the term are. And what I think it really means is that people want to have access to the sacred without going through institutional and doctrinal scaffolding. They want a more direct experience of Spirit and God, and I don't think it's going to go away." And she says, for much of Christianity, this is bad news. The what questions, as she calls them, the what questions about belief. What do you believe in? What must I believe in to be saved? Are the very kinds of questions that are causing people to slip into the gap. Doctrine is seen not as only being divisive, but as contrary to the message Jesus himself taught. She says, as a pastor asked me, "Can we stop reciting the creed, please? I'm tired of driving people away from church." Theologian Dwight Friesen puts it bluntly and speaks for many when he says that Jesus had no interest in orthodoxy, but rather offered his followers a full and flourishing human life. And so this is where we are. But interestingly enough, at least to me, Diana Butler Bass says that while many folks think that belief is going to go away, she doesn't think that belief is going to go away. Because she says the fact of the matter is that our entire way of living is anchored by beliefs. We all have beliefs. And we all live by those beliefs, whether we think about them or not. And in the religious realm, The problem isn't that we have beliefs. It's the way we have come to identify the word belief with intellectual assent to certain doctrines. And she says what we need to do within the religious communities is to go back. That intellectual piece kept growing during the centuries within Orthodox Christianity. But she said if you go back to what belief meant early on, both within Old English and she said in German, the Germanic languages, belief actually meant love. To believe was to be love. To believe was to give your heart to something and your life to something. And that's what belief meant. It's not a brain thing, it's a heart and person thing. And so she says that's what we need to be reframing our language when we talk about belief within our Christian communities. To talk about what is it we are willing to give our heart to, our life to, and our time and our resources to, which follow our heart and our life. And the questions we ask are not what we believe then, but how we believe and who we believe. The how question. She says the first how question Christians need to ask themselves and answer is the question that she gets all the time when she identifies herself as a Christian. And people say to her, how can you possibly believe that? How can you possibly believe that anymore? How do we believe? How do we think about what we believe in? Those are the kinds of questions that we need to be asking. She refers to Parker Palmer, who refers to the shift from what to how language as part of the inner search that enables individuals to develop the habits of heart necessary to forming both a grounded moral life and a caring community. He says that inner life questions are the sort of questions that Americans ask more regularly now, and these are the questions that churches often fail to address. Institutions, he says, cannot dictate answers to how questions. They can talk about what you can believe, the questions that people are kind of falling away from now, but they cannot dictate how questions. How can I connect with something larger than my own ego? This, Palmer insists, involves going beyond the teaching of the what of things into the labor-intensive process of teaching the how of things. How shall we live together? How shall we use our time? How shall we believe in a manner that reflects the values that we want to live out of? And then there is the who do I believe? Beth says that teaching in seminary, she asked the question, who do you believe when you have something you need to talk to people about something that's important to you? And she says, she gets two answers. She says, her students say they talk to their friends first, and she says, Google. They get on the internet, and they begin looking things up on the internet. And they go to Facebook, and that's where they go for answers to questions. Friends and Facebook. And she says, what you will not hear is that they don't say that they go to what had been considered to be the trusted authority figures, like teachers and pastors and others in institutions. And she says that's because we have just had this institutional crisis. And she talks in the book about how the last 2 decades preceding our present time have been horrible decades for institutions, for government, and for all of the scandals and problems in government, and the complete breakdown in trust and the gridlock that's happened in government. And so, elected officials are not people that are trusted. And all of the religious sex scandals that have just completely led to an end of trust in religious institutions, both in Catholic and on the Protestant side. And so there's been this great breakdown in institutions, and all of these typical authority figures, police officers and elected officials and pastors and others, are not the people that young people think of when they want to go and find help anymore. And she said the biggest challenge and the biggest task within faith communities is to rebuild that trust and to understand how important it is that people are not just going to listen to those who have expertise anymore, or those who have the training anymore. That authority springs from two sources, and one is relationship, and the other is authenticity. Authority comes through connection. When people give their time to the communities and are accountable to the communities and listen to those in the communities and earn, essentially, that trust. And when people act with authenticity, when it springs from good motives and it's praiseworthy intentions, and when people practice what they preach, that's the kind of authority, the only kind of authority, she says, that young people in particular will pay any attention to. Authority that is earned through trust in relationship, and where people walk the talk and they can see that from the people that they are around in communities. And she says that is the number one job in faith communities, to understand the task, that it's going to be a long process of rebuilding that trust and working in relationships and being accountable to communities and demonstrating that we live what we preach. And then, and only then, will those who are part of our communities begin to pay attention to us. And as I said earlier, I think that's nothing but good news for religious communities and for Christianity. There's no coasting anymore on the privilege of power or tradition or expertise. And in this culture we live in, where everything about us and about everything can be known, there's no longer anywhere to hide the rot and the corruption. We are more exposed, and everyone and everything has to be more transparent for there to be trust. I actually think we are much closer in context and spirit to the beginning of the Jesus movement and the beginning of Christianity, when building relationship and acting in trustworthy ways was the only way to make anybody listen. And I mean, that's what Jesus did. Jesus lived with a group of people and called through his own life and his own example and his own conversation a group of followers who built up over time, and slowly that movement grew. But it was about building relationships and caring for one another and acting in authentic and trustworthy ways. That's the only way the movement could grow, and did grow. And that's where we are. The only big difference is Jesus, and then especially those who followed him, didn't have the baggage that we have. We have the baggage of 2,000 years of Christianity, and we have some explaining to do for that. And as I say that, I always feel like I need to also say, it's not all bad. I mean, 2,000 years of Christian culture, there's a lot that's awfully wonderful about that culture, and you don't want to throw it out. But we can't count on that. We can't count on carrying us along anymore. We have to make our case. And it's interesting to me. I didn't plan on talking about Father's Day, It is Father's Day. And we said Happy Father's Day to all the fathers except for Mark Gingrich. Happy Father's Day, Mark. It's really the same story. It's amazing to me how similar the stories are. I mean, Todd was talking a little bit, what I grew up with in terms of what father and grandfather meant and the things that you took for granted and maybe as important to me when I was growing up, the things that you did not question, but you just did and listened to and obeyed. Trust and obey, for there's no other way. And that doesn't work anymore either. It doesn't work anymore. We are, fathers are in a very different place in our culture today, and it's for many fathers it's a challenging place to be. I mean, I think I've talked before. My poor father, when my mother got involved in the women's movement, my father did not know what hit him. His whole world changed. And it took him years and years to come to terms with that. And just with having to do things that he never had to do. He didn't grow up having to do. His father never did things like he had to do at home. And as I say, for where we are in the church, I say for fathers, it's exactly where we need to be. It is much better to be at where we are and to building the relationships that we can build and to not just assume that our children will do what we say or listen to us because we are the father or the mother. Works both ways. It's a good place to be. But it's challenging. It's a challenging time. And the very best thing to do is not to mourn what has passed. I don't know how many people watch Mad Men. Do you watch Mad Men? I have watched it occasionally. And I think, talk about a nostalgic, unhealthy way to spend some time thinking that those are the good old days. They're not the good old days at all. I would not want to go back there. So thank you for listening. Over the next couple weeks, I'm going to continue talking about Diana Butler Bass and talking next week a little bit more about the practice part and what people are looking for in terms of spirituality is actual practice. Not what to think, but tell me what to do. Show me how to live. That's what we're talking about. Thank you for listening.